Hi, thanks for joining us today in this session where Optiv, Brinqa and Checkmarx are going to be discussing elevating your cyber risk posture. Now I'd like to introduce Pete Chestnut, our CISO for North America.
Hi, my name is Pete Chestnut, 30 years of developer, AppSec for 17 years, both as a vendor and a practitioner running a large AppSec program at a financial institution for 2.5 years. Thanks.
And we're also joined by Alex Babar from Brinqa.
Hey everyone, so I'm Alex from Brinqa. I head up product marketing. Been key to launching on the Brinqa side the Checkmarx and Brinqa partnership, and love to share more information about how that actually looks and feels with you all today.
And we're also joined by Sean Asmus from Optiv. Sean?
Yeah, hello. Sean Asmus, former recovering software developer turned cybersecurity professional. I've been doing that over 20 years, and I've been with Optiv for over 13. So glad to speak with you all today.
Thanks, Sean. And last but not least, we also have James joining from Brinqa, who's going to be our in charge of our demos today. So welcome, James. Good to meet you.
Hi everyone, James Walta. I run our solutions engineering over here at Brinqa. I've been with Brinqa for over 6 years at this point. Worked with a lot of mutual customers here with both Checkmarx and Optiv team, and looking forward to today's demo.
Thanks. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Pete, Alex, and Sean to kick off our discussion today. Alex?
All right. Well, thanks for that intro, Mike. So just for everyone listening in, I think there's no shortage of buzz around application security posture management, or application security is one of the fastest growing areas in cybersecurity. So we're going to take a little bit of a different approach today. We're not going to present to you for 30 minutes and then show you a demo for 10. We're going to spend real quick just a few minutes chatting about like why we're here today, followed up by we'll jump straight into the demo so you could see it. You don't have to kind of take it from us. You can see what an actual tool solution looks like. In this case, it's something that the Checkmarx and Brinqa have been working towards together. We'll actually jump out of that demo, talk about what we saw, and then we'll jump back into a demo part 2. So definitely stay with us. There'll be a lot of good stuff to see and hear. On that note, I'll key it off, and then Sean, Pete, would love to know if you have any additional commentary before we go into the first part of James's demo. But if I kind of think back and say, well, why did this partnership happen? It's like, well, there's a growing need to detect a variety of growing security issues on a variety of growing security or IT assets, right? And so there's a bunch of different tools and telemetry coming from a bunch of different sources. And so, there's value in putting it in one place, but not stopping there, to be able to kind of prioritize and triage with context on top of that, to be able to orchestrate or automate the remediation process a little bit. And then probably most notably is the ability to report on that in a way that works for your key stakeholders. So executive reports for your executive team, operational reports for your operational team, and being able to do that all from one place. So that's some of what we'll show you today. Real quick, I just want to kind of like cut through the jargon of application security posture management, cyber risk posture, all that sort of stuff, and just kind of give you a kind of key definition of how we're defining the core capabilities we'll discuss today. And so one is being able to prioritize what actually matters with context. We'll dive into that more. 2, how to streamline the remediation process for those prioritized issues. And so we want this to work together with each other. And then to be able to actually continuously monitor and report on those risks and the remediation process. But again, like at the different levels of the organization as you need to actually motivate remediation owners, business risk owners, motivate other folks to act. So with that said, Pete, Sean, do you want to add anything before we hop into the demo?
Yeah, I mean, there's really 3 big reasons why I think about ASPM as a very important market. So one, as an AppSec tooling vendor, we have a limited viewpoint. So if you think of that as the Venn diagram of what we see. So even if you think something as infrastructure as code, well, the output of infrastructure as code is infrastructure. That infrastructure also has scanners that come in on the shift right kind of angle to say, hey, here's what I've seen, open ports, etc. We don't have that visibility from our tooling. So you need someone that takes the output of those shift right tools to bring to the shift left of a Checkmarx type solution that can see what generated it, provide that business context over it. And so that's one reason. The second one is, well, to the degree that you could have one single vendor for all of your AppSec needs, you might be able to get away with just that vendor's kind of ASPM layer that they sit on top of their tooling. But that's hardly the case if you're talking about anywhere at scale. You know, constantly in sales conversations, like, what languages do you code in? Yes. What IDEs do you use? Yes. What SCMs do you use? Yes. It's you know, there is no limitation to what the developers use. Means that your AppSec vendors are not going to be able to cater to everything. So that's really reason number two. And three is to bring that business context to it by allowing you to do those groupings, integrate in with other sources of data to say, here's why this repository is important, because if we drive up the stack as applications grow and change in what they mean, what does it mean to be an application, and you provide that business context by latching into other sources of data, you can put it into dollars and cents, as you said, that kind of executive level dashboard.
Yeah, and Pete, I think even beyond that, many organizations continue to struggle with simply just having a unified platform to be able to serve as that source of truth for that business context, certainly for the unification of all of those vulnerabilities, and really sort of considering the people element of it all, right? Making sure that all of these teams that are, you know, embedded in this security program are fully aligned, mostly in agreement with how critical each application or asset is to the organization, and actually to be able to manage that over time, right? As things change in the industry, as threat actors gear up with new, you know, tactics and procedures and various other things in the wild. O-days certainly can disrupt anyone's, you know, day-to-day as far as process and workflows, right? So having a system or a solution to be able to serve as that point of reference, but then also that communication vehicle, as you mentioned, for reporting. Alex, you said, you know, really the overall aspects of, you know, really a true workable, meaningful, and, you know, actionable system to bring it all together. I think that's really what's, you know, from the clients we were talking with, is sort of that emerging need and a kind of a gap in their own programs that really, you know, today, you know, either introduces or maintains a lot of friction between security and developers, but also requires a lot of people to maintain, right, and to operationalize as far as a program goes. So from the people side of things, that's where I feel a lot of the focus perhaps is undersold. But as we talk with our clients, certainly, you know, it takes experts to be able to drive towards results, right? At the end of the day, it's all about, you know, reducing risk.
Sweet. All right. So it's time to show off a little bit, and just so you know kind of what you're about to see. You heard it a few times. Reports are absolutely important, but think about it kind of in a visual of an iceberg, right? Reports are really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot that goes into making reports that matter, reports that are accurate, reports that are actionable, right? So to do that, so James can actually start off not by kind of showing at the vulnerability level, but going from a top-down view of the business into the vulnerabilities, so you can kind of see this unique view or point of, you know, kind of perspective of analyzing your risks. So with that, James, are you ready to get started and show the demo?
Yep, I think we're good. As Alex mentioned, right, we had a lot of really good mentions around, you know, what we're actually aggregating here across multiple attack surfaces within the Brinqa environment. And I think a place where that makes sense to really start the conversation is to look at what that organizational structure, what that business environment actually looks like. In Brinqa, we're correlating not just scanning solutions to get a technical detail of vulnerabilities and findings that are being discovered through the scanning process, but we're also tying that in with sources of truth that help us construct that business hierarchy. In this case, I'm starting my conversation around more of our business service layer. So we've been able to build out the organizational structure and really understand the assets that are being scanned, how they support different lines of business, how they're grouped together by form and function. And so in this case, if we go a step deeper, if we look into one of our lines of business, in this case, we'll expand upon our digital storefront here. What we can really start to understand and visualize is how this business service fits in. In this case, there's additional context we can see on the consolidation card here. So this business service is actually a part of a larger business unit. And it also has ownership. We might have a director or an executive responsible for the risk and maintenance of that line of business as well. But importantly, as we start to look at the more aggregate view of risk representation, we have, as Peter mentioned, many different scanning solutions, not just across the DevSecOps side, but also on the infrastructure risk, looking at vulnerabilities and policy violations that are being discovered on servers and databases that help host our applications. We can start to see that collection of assets within that line of business as well. So in this case, we have a number of applications that we can see. We also have different servers and databases, and multiple pages of these asset records that, as we can see from the source icons, are being aggregated together and really help represent that aggregate risk and asset view. If we go a step further, I'll choose one of my applications here. The way that we construct an application, the way we think about an application in Brinqa, is really more of that business level view or that product perspective. So in this case, we have multiple code projects that are a part of the application story. And within those code projects, we actually have the risk that's been identified. So in this case, this virtuecon.com application that we have has 5 different associated code projects that are being scanned. We have sites that are more for the DAST results of where that application has been deployed. And then we also have supporting infrastructure. So again, just kind of breaking those layers down and really understanding for our deployed applications, what infrastructure do they depend on? What servers are actually hosting that web application and keeping it running? What databases are storing the data and processing that? Now, as we go further into the subcomponents here, if we start to look at the actual details of the applications themselves, we can look at one of the code projects in particular. In this case, this is a code project that has had scans performed against it. We have a number of results, a number of findings that have been discovered through the various scans. So SAS, DAST, SCA scans on the application side. But importantly, as we start to aggregate this data, we're also dealing with the conversation of prioritization, right? We're needing to understand, how do we take data points? How do we take multiple vulnerabilities and findings across individual scanning solutions and blend them together so that way we can have that normalized conversation of risk? And a way that we present that is through the Brinqa risk scoring process, which takes advantage of a modifier that we call risk factors. Risk factors is a way to take a normalized score and make adjustments to that risk score based on the individual business needs and criticality of each organization that we're collecting this information from. In this case, we can see one of our example findings here, our SQL injection result, has a couple risk factors associated, and it's actually putting us into the critical range of prioritization. So in this case, not only do we see the details of the finding itself, we've got the description recommendation, but if we focus on the risk window here that we see on the right-hand side that I'm highlighting, we can actually see visibility into that prioritization process. So we're taking into account that this finding has started its life with a base risk score of 7 out of 10. But with those modifiers that we mentioned, the risk factors as we call them, this particular finding is associated to an asset that supports a critical business service. And in addition to that, it's also one of our targeted findings. So we have 2 different risk factors that are helping adjust the priority, the criticality of this finding. And because of that, there's a risk factor offset. So what we started with was a 7 out of 10. We've increased it by 3 points. And due to this personalized prioritization, we're now treating it with a risk of 10 out of 10. It's now within our critical SLA band. So using these risk factors, configuring this prioritization journey in addition to the normalized context that we're collecting from our various security solutions that are deployed within our environment, we're now able to have a more high-level prioritization conversation and really understand more broad-level risk impact throughout the organization. We can start to fuse the story of risk across our multiple security tools and now represent risk at a business level and aggregate that normalized score all the way up to report throughout the entire organization.
So I think this is probably a great place to pause before we resume more later. And again, we'll focus more on kind of the remediation side and the reporting side. But I'd love to hear Sean and Pete kind of what you think about context and particularly kind of threat context, compensating controls, that sort of stuff. We just did a high level view in the demo. But before that, I just want to help folks understand kind of how to make sense of application security posture management as a software category, because it's super messy. Like literally, I think there's over a dozen, if not 2, sample vendors on the Gartner side of the world. And if you actually look in, like application security testing is a well-known, well-understood software category, of which, you know, Checkmarx has been a leader for, I feel like a decade, but I think 6 years might be the accurate one. And then Brinqa on the other side has recently been tagged in the ASPM side. And so the reality is there's overlap here. So it's important to break apart core capabilities of what you want the software to do and then optional capabilities. So kind of in the latest round of Gartner reports, if you're interested in what the analysts have to say, they're adding ASPM, the ability to kind of prioritize better, unify better, this sort of thing, as an optional capability for application security testing tools and suites. On the ASPM side, while the core is around unifying and prioritizing, some of the stuff we just showed you, there's optional capabilities and some vendors out there that also do some elements of the scanning, right? When we talk about just to be very clear about Checkmarx and Brinqa, essentially what you're getting is you're getting a kind of top tier AST scanning solution with a bunch of scanning engines, comprehensive scanning engines under one platform, Checkmarx One. And on the Brinqa side, Brinqa doesn't do any scanning, just to be clear. So all those findings you saw on the Brinqa demo are being sourced from some other, scanner detection tool, or different method of entry into Brinqa. And then Brinqa is focused on being the most comprehensive in terms of asset type coverage, modeling your business, extensibility on reports. So for example, if you think about kind of you're trying to cut through the new buzz in ASPM, there's some new tools that might be an all-in-one. They're offering scanning plus some of this stuff, but maybe only for your cloud native apps, right? So I heard, Pete, you said it earlier about doing this at scale. And then I'd also add like with any sort of history, IT legacy to manage. And very quickly, it's like this ASPM for one niche, not enterprise-wide. So with that, I think everyone then has an understanding of, we just showed you a solution. We talked about high level. I love to hand it back to Sean and Pete to chat a little bit about what they saw before then we move into demo part 2 on remediation and reporting.
Well, and I'll start this off. So the ability to put vulnerability data into shared meaningful context is critical, especially at scale. The good people that are staffing security organizations today are strapped in terms of bandwidth, and they quickly burn out, not having good enough tools, not having sufficient time to do proper analysis, nor sufficient time to consult with product teams on what a particular vulnerability even means. And then you put that in a greater business context of just the overall talent shortage of finding, the right staff and experts really to support that engine of risk management. So in terms of context, again, putting it sort of in a platform and kind of extracting it out of the heads of the professionals that are running these teams, I think is really helpful. And as as you showed in the demo there, the the data is there, right? There's also the added bonus of it being sort of a live view into the current state of your scanning output, your remediation status, et cetera, right? And so it sort of changes the game as far as the paradigm of, I have to take a look at this report today, analyze it, interpret it, and then, drive towards remediation. And again, this is sort of from the seat of a security professional and a security team to like, oh, now I have a real-time view into a platform that enables me to do all of that, but much quicker and with less of a cognitive load, and other benefits that are probably beyond the sake of time here. So Pete, I'm curious as to your take and all of that.
Yeah, the strength in these solutions is the AppSec adjacencies. So AppSec testing itself, yeah, we feel like we have that one completely under control. But when you start to add in the other sources of data, so we saw some of that in the demo today. But if you have other tooling, and every big organization does, infrastructure and your patch management and all of those data sources coming in, and then you've got the kind of data sources where I hold the contact information for a certain application. I know what part of the business that comes from. Those sources of data don't live in AppSec. They're not in the SCM. So you're taking what is proper AppSec and then bringing in the contextual data from other sources around that are related to application, but are not application. Checkmarx doesn't go and scan to say, oh, here is your organizational structure and how that organization relates to application. It also doesn't have access to your infrastructure scan data. So the way you bring that together to give you the context that you need to understand the real risk of this particular vulnerability or this particular application is incredibly important. And that's why that ASPM industry exists.
Thanks. James, I'll tell a quick story while you get set up for the next round of demo. But Pete, Sean, here's what you think about this. You remind me of what you're saying, Pete, of a conversation I had a couple of years ago with a security researcher. So I forget the specific vulnerability. It was tied to GitHub Actions. It's like, GitHub released that. There's a lot of stuff in the CI/CD. And kind of from his perspective, it was, no, this is the technically correct way to remediate the actual risk of something that he discovered, right? And I'm on the content production side. So as I was writing a blog, I was like, yeah, but at the end of the day, can't you just have stronger access control? I was like, yes, it's a compensating control. And he accused me of thinking like a CISO, which I love. But it brings me to one important piece of context. I know a lot of times we're like adding threat context into things. Hey, it's more risky than you thought. It's more risky than you thought. I think it does feel like compensating controls or mitigating controls are getting more traction. As far as, this is, non-production server, there's MFA tied to this, just again, to truly assess your risk of not just what's important, because everything's important, but what's important today, what's important right now. So
I'll argue the other point.
Controls. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, the fact is that all of this tooling that you are aggregating gives you more work than you could ever accomplish in your entire lifetime. Period. I could work till the end of my days and still not get to the bottom of the list. So the importance of being able to provide some context that allows you to say, if I have two things with the same criticality, how do I say one's more important than the other? What drives me to say I should focus on this one instead of this one? Yeah, every security professional would like to fix all the stuff. But even in that demo, there were 50,000 vulnerabilities in that scan, 51,000, I think. Well, okay, that's a pretty damn big number. What's number one? And if you can't directionally give some guidance to say, start here, how do you know that you're accomplishing the right things? How do you know you're doing the right thing for the business and moving the security needle to make you more secure faster? Because you're not going to get to it all. Sorry.
All right, so that's a perfect segue. So real quick plug. We covered a little bit on risk factors, so that's the context that we're talking about. If you want to learn more, follow up with us after the webinar. It's perfect segue. James is going to show you a little bit more about remediation. So just because we found it, just because we've identified the most important, if we don't actually remediate, address, or fix, or accept the most important risk, like what are we doing, right? So that's we're gonna move into the UIs again, so you could see it for yourselves in this next round of demo. You ready, James?
Yep, we're ready to go.
Great.
All right. Thanks, Alex. So yeah, as we kind of queued up there, right? The next topic, once we get through prioritization, is really what do we do with these reprioritized vulnerabilities and findings? And there's really two major ways to look at how we act upon that data. We're going to talk through both of these here in the upcoming demo, but the first one is remediation, and then we'll end with more of the reporting, visibility, and insight into the data. And as Peter correctly alluded to, right, it is a large volume of vulnerabilities and findings we're dealing with in all of these environments. The more security tools we aggregate, we're only adding to the number of vulnerabilities that we're having to sort through and look at. And so as we discussed the risk scoring with risk factors, right, and Alex kind of correctly kind of pointed back to that, those are those indicators of where we look at organizational context to help clarify where we start that process. Right. If we have a large number of critical vulnerabilities, when we talk about how they're prioritized from the scanning solutions, that's a starting point. It's a good indicator of effectively how bad that vulnerability is or how risky that individual type of vulnerability is. But being able to use risk factors and add into that risk scoring story to look at, okay, we know how bad it is, but based on where it's deployed within the environment, or what does recent threat intelligence tell us about that particular vulnerability and how it's being treated, those additional factors then help us, clear up that landscape, help us denoise that environment and have more accurate prioritization. Now, once we have that more accurate prioritization, once we really start to understand what we should be acting on, then it becomes, okay, well, how do we act on them? And that transitions us more into the ticketing story here. And so in this case, we can see I have my ticket inventory system where I can view all of the tickets that Brinqa's created. We're going to take a quick minute here and just look at how those tickets were set up, how we used automation to create these tickets at scale and kind of crunch down on the volume. But what this gives us is that actionable result. So we're using Brinqa to take that more accurate prioritized context, leveraging some of that business context as well to create more powerful tickets. And as we can see here in our ticket overview, we can also monitor the remediation lifecycle. So not only are we creating a more powerful ticket to act on, but we're going back to those scanning solutions. We're collecting information around rescan results and monitoring the actual remediation of these individual vulnerabilities and findings. And that gives us this progress bar that we see over here on the right. And this is automatically attached to the ticket itself. So we're also pulling away from that need to manually monitor, to manually manage tickets, in addition to just cutting down on the overall volume. So when we look at some of these tickets here, let's go into an automation rule that was actually used to create a lot of these tickets. And in the automation rule itself, there's really two areas of focus that we're helping the Brinqa solution identify on what do we actually want to do using this automation. First is scope of data, right? We don't need to go out and create tickets for every little thing that's found. So what do we want to focus on for ticket creation? Now, in this case, within our query part of our automation, we're defining that data set. So I'm looking for, in this case, static code findings where the risk rating is critical, right? So going back to our previous topic, reprioritizing vulnerabilities, taking into account business context to understand what's truly critical, and therefore deprioritizing things that may have a higher severity but impact a lower, critical part of the organization, or maybe it's part of our test environment. Now we can really get down to what are those critical vulnerabilities. And with this data set, then we can take an action against that set of data. Now, in this case, there's a number of actions we can support within our automation engine. We have many valid use cases around setting ownership and adding tags, maybe just sending summary notifications. But in this case, we want to very directly work with the remediation process. So we've selected to create a static code ticket that utilizes our sprint process. Now, In order to complete that action, there's just a few inputs we need to provide. We guide the automation through how to successfully complete these actions at scale. So in this case, we have sprints that we can associate it to. I've just gone ahead and defined it as a part of our sprint 1, which started back at the end of July, and it uses a 2-week sprint duration. So every 2 weeks, we're starting a new sprint cycle. We're plugging into our developer workflow and working with those current constraints. And then we also provide the SLA cycle as well. So given the criticality of the ticket, what SLAs do we want to add to these tickets? In this case, we'll just use the default ticket SLAs. The important piece within the automation that kind of goes back to our previous point of how we have large ticket volume, but we deduplicate those individual tickets, that's done with the grouping scenario. So in this case, I can look at all of these critical static code findings that I've said I want to create tickets for, and I can just choose that if a couple attributes are in common or like across multiple findings, then let's group those individual static code findings together onto a single ticket. So in this case, we're saying if it's the same type of finding, if it's referencing the same definition, and if it's discovered on the same asset, so if it's a part of the same code project, I don't need multiple tickets to be created and assigned out. If I have SQL injection in multiple places of the same code project, let's just create a single ticket and point them to all the locations that require remediation. So they can jump in, they can do those fixes all in one go. We now have a much more efficient process. Once we have the ticket creation started, we've completed that action. We can also work through automated assignment. Who is this ticket actually going to be assigned to? In this case, I can do static assignment, point it to one user or team, or I can do dynamic assignment as well, and maybe point these directly to whoever the remediation owner or whoever's responsible for the actual assets themselves that are being scanned. So here I can use remediation owner, and we'll dynamically assign these tickets to the appropriate team for that code project or for that application that's having tickets being created. Now, once this action is complete, we have tickets. We have consolidated action to go and act against. We're assigning them dynamically to the remediation teams that are responsible for those assets. But then we realize that in our environments, not all of the time are they working directly out of Brinqa. So we can also push these tickets that we've created through another action to external ITSMs. So commonly we're seeing integrations with ServiceNow or Jira or Azure DevOps, Sherwell, and we're using Brinqa to really create that more powerful content, but then using our orchestration to really route those tickets to the appropriate environment where that dev team is already working or where that IT patch team is managing their asset inventory and their ticket backlog. And so that's an overview of the automations environment in Brinqa, using specifically the remediation ticket creation rule as an example of one way that we can interact with this aggregated data and really continue the story from prioritization, now moving into action. What do we actually do with these vulnerabilities and findings within our environment? Now, another output, another response that we talked about earlier on the demo is more of the reporting side. How do we actually visualize and get insight into these aggregated vulnerabilities and findings within our environment? So we have a couple different reports here that we'll walk through just very quickly. The first is a more high-level report. This is focusing on risk across all of our different security integrations, looking at aggregation throughout our organizational environment from that business level lens. So in this case, this is more of a director report. We can see our different business units, our different asset types that are being scanned and discovered within our environment. And as we scroll through this report, we get good high-level information, high-level visibility into the different types of findings, where they're discovered throughout our environment, what types of risk prioritization is most common throughout our environment. So where are we most prioritizing? Where are we most deprioritizing risk in terms of the risk factors that we've established? How are they being used? And then also monitoring remediation lifecycle overview. So as we get into that remediation process, it's not just automation to create tickets, but also continuing to monitor them. looking at validated rescans and which teams have, the best closure rate within their SLAs, which tickets are, creeping past due, really being able to track and monitor all of that remediation lifecycle. But as we have these high-level reports, it's also important to be able to adjust that scope. So on the right side, I have different inputs, different ways that I can narrow down or change the perspective of this report. And what this enables our customers to do is to take a report that does start at more of that high-level organizational context, but jump into different teams or different divisions without having to create new reports from scratch. Here, for example, I can jump into one of our business services that we used earlier in the demo. We focused on the digital storefront business service, where we first started to look at how assets are aggregated, how they're correlated into the Brinqa environment. If I use that as an input, we can see here the entire report changes, and now I have a more personalized report. If I'm a director just for this line of business, just for digital storefront, now I've got a report that is focusing on only my assets. I can answer those same questions that we were answering on the original version of this report, but now it's a more narrow scope. I'm able to focus on just what falls under my scope of responsibility in terms of assets, findings, and the remediation process. Now, if we take that report as more of a high-level report, there are other reports within the Brinqa environment as well. This one focuses really more on the actual finding details themselves. It's a little bit more of a technical report, one that would be very useful for analysts or DevSecOps teams or patch teams within our environment to really understand what they're responsible for, how their individual assets are being affected throughout this prioritization process and vulnerability scanning. And what this report gives us is a good breakdown of not just the summary level details of what's being discovered, but also information around timeline. For all the vulnerabilities within our environment, what's the oldest vulnerability by publish date? What's our detection in terms of response? When did we first start fixing some of the open vulnerabilities within our current environment? Looking at details around, again, prioritization, but maybe a little bit more of a technical scope. For the vulnerabilities that you're responsible for, what are the biggest drivers and risk? What are the most common risk factors that you're seeing for your individual assets? Do you own a critical piece of business, right? Is it more around regulatory compliance, where we have a large number of different regulatory flags that are driving risk for the assets that you own? And just getting into other details around the remediation process. But again, more at that low-level technical report, where we're really seeing individual asset ownership from those remediation teams. So those first two reports, more high-level from the director side, and then this report showing a little bit more technical details around individual assets. We also have another report that's a more example of more of a response type report, where in this case, we were able to create a report that tracks Log4j occurrences throughout our individual scanned environment. And not only to track and identify where they're being discovered, but really help with that remediation journey, right? When these zero-day vulnerabilities pop up, one of the most common questions that's asked for these teams is, how are we handling our response to them? Step one is prioritize, make sure that we're targeting and protecting those most critical assets. But as we do that, as we look through that reprioritized view and start making progress, the conversation very quickly shifts to how quickly can we remediate and resolve all of these zero-day vulnerabilities within our environment. So in this particular report, we have overview into that burn rate. We can see our total number of vulnerabilities that still exist within our environment and how that number has changed over time. So we can see that currently we've dropped that total count down to 29. And then of those Log4j vulnerabilities that remain within our environment, from an overall organizational view, what is the total breakdown of how they're being prioritized? Of what's left, we're saying 14 of them are still critical, 6 of them are high, and then 9 fall in the medium and low category of what's left for prioritization. And then a more broken down view by line of business, again, keeping that business context in the story and using that to overlay with this information, we can then get that risk breakdown by line of business. So as these individual directors log in, as we know which teams manage those assets, we can still track that overall risk distribution for our different lines of business within the organization as well. So this is a good report showing a more real world example of a more active response to threats and vulnerabilities as they show up within our environment, and how we're able to track those burn down rates, risk distribution, and use that prioritization story to help really understand the current impact.
Thanks, James. And one thing I want to add is, it's easy to talk about this sometimes. It's easy to understand the problem conceptually. So we wanted to spend the time today, kind of show you in the flesh, so to speak, how this looks. One little piece I want to kind of add there is we are kind of in the market seeing some appetite for some additional security controls around kind of the reports themselves. So in terms of role-based access controls. Just kind of those executive reports, the executives don't necessarily need access to the scanning tool used to detect the finding. They just really need the report. So it's a little bit more need to know. Whereas conversely, if you're, a remediation owner, you need a lot more telemetry, but maybe the information on risks tied to other business lines that have no relation to me, I don't need access to that. So that's the last of the demo that we'll show. Thanks so much, James, for sharing that with everyone today. Hope that was helpful. We do want to kind of wrap up with a little bit more conversation on our end. So I want to hear from Sean and Pete around kind of reactions to the demo and the problems. But real quick, I want to ask, so we've got interesting mix of perspectives. So I'm obviously on the Brinqa perspective, a little bit biased. I could speak for Gartner on the analyst side. So they're predicting, so just to level set everyone, ASPM is about 5% penetrated, according to Gartner's research, but they're predicting an 8x increase in the next 3 years, which is pretty fast. That said, on the hype cycle, like it's literally at the top of the hype cycle, and there's a lot that goes into it. People, process, technology. We could chat on some of that. But I'm very curious. So Sean and Pete, what kind of your take is? Like, do you think? Let me form this in the sense of a question. Do you think it'll grow faster, slower, or on par to Gartner's prediction of 8x in 3 years for unifying and being able to prioritize and report on all this stuff with context?
So classic consulting answer, it depends. Economic wins and current state of everything, aside, I think that seeing solutions emerge in the market where capabilities that ultimately reduce that manual effort to manage and operate programs like this, I think that will drive some of that momentum and the acceleration that Gartner speaks of. So it's really great to see in the demo, operationally at various levels within the platform, how that can, that the level of data and level of functionality that you're giving the various stakeholders and users. I think it speaks a lot to how this could actually look like in the real world, right? I think one of the big values there is, kind of in the viability of a solution like this is that it comes again. I'm always going back to the people element, right? The programs are often constrained by not only the number of or whether it's the ratio of security developers, but also the pace at which product teams are moving. And it's, security is, I think, going to be lagging behind for a good while. But tools like this, I think, allows them to at least catch up in the race. So I'm really excited about seeing the capabilities that Brinqa built within your platform, and really excited to have worked with you and Checkmarx on this over the past few months.
So my answer is a little more nuanced. So I think as a ASPM market in general is going to be slower. And the reason for that is for small and medium businesses that can standardize on a single vendor. Every one of those vendors is building some form of ASPM. We're all platforms. We all have tools to the degree that you could say, I can just be on Checkmarx. And if we can provide you some prioritization and normalization of that data, that may be enough for you. In places where you have multiple data sources, that's less the case. And I think that the big headwind that is faced by this market is the fact that everyone has something today. Now it's homegrown and brittle, requires a lot of upkeep, but it's still a displacement. You got to stop doing what you were doing and bring something else in. There's lots in there in Brinqa's solution that could drive people to go to Brinqa on that. But I know large enterprises, they have what they think of as ASPM under the guise of vulnerability management, where they try to sew those things together and do their own ETL. And really the factor that's going to drive them is it's drudge work, and you should just go get a vendor that can do that for you. So I think overall that mix is going to really drive things. If you can convince people that it's cheaper and easier to come to a solution like you, great. And again, for that small and medium, if that market expansion of 8 times includes small and medium, I think it's probably more like half that.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's a good point too. So one of my favorite anecdotes that I hear in Brinqa is so we have a customer doing it by it's a displacement. A lot of it's DIY, oftentimes in spreadsheets.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some I guess like nuances and details that matter to some folks. There's a question on kind of, is it enough to get the ball moving into the direction of a kind of more formal solution? It's snapshots of data versus continuous data. I know there's some concerns about kind of, now that you've exported the data out of the tools that they were in, now where's the actual source of truth? So that's been kind of bubbling. But my by far favorite, like what reason is there to get started, has to be, well, they were exporting all this stuff into Excel and they got tired of adding memory to Excel to the box so it could load the growing list of vulnerabilities. And so I think, Pete, you said it a couple of times, but just kind of piggyback on that. Like, I do think scale matters a lot in terms of how big you are, how broad you want to go. So we focused on application security a lot today, but what I mean by that, and Pete mentioned vulnerability management, is on the Brinqa side, we're seeing an appetite from large enterprises to create kind of a horizontal, if you will, program that spans across that kind of like traditional vulnerability risk management telemetry. So, think your Qualys findings, Rapid7, Tenable, and then also getting your application security findings all into one place. And then it's very interesting because I think I'd be curious your take, but the cloud findings seem to come in either pillar, either the evolution of my infrastructure scans and my VMs, or with the cloud native software is kind of like bucketed into AppSec. But it does feel like the trend, whether it's a bot solution, a DIY, what I thought I was hearing from you, Pete, was that, and Sean, was that there is a trend to try and make sense of this, to ultimately just kind of, I joke, it's an easy to ask question, hard to answer question of what risk poses the most vulnerability, or what vulnerability poses the most risk to my business right now. There's a bunch of ways you could solve that problem. It's a hard problem. Sounds like it's worth solving, though. So I think that mostly wraps us up. But real quick, Sean, Pete, I want to give you another opportunity to add anything you want before we close it out. Anything that you want to double back on that we covered today, or that we didn't have time to cover today, you want to plug?
So from my side, I think it really boils down to, organizations are looking to feel confident, and maybe even beyond feeling, to demonstrate confidence that they're focusing on the right things within their security programs. It's a challenge, right? It's a complex problem to solve, especially when you roll into the equation application security, and the complexities of how applications are developed, where they're deployed, how they're maintained, where the data tends to flow, et cetera, right? So having a solution in the market, right, to be able to at least help with the confidence factor, I think it's a wonderful thing. So again, kind of it still relates to the people element. Certainly don't want to downplay the technology piece of this as well. The automation, the workflows to reduce that burden of manual process, and many of the other benefits that come with a platform and a solution like this. I think it will continue to emerge. Really excited to see where it goes. And at the end of the day, it's all about reducing risk, and that's why we're here. So,
and I'm going to key off of that, because one of the things you said, Alex, is, you're adding more memory to increase the spreadsheet. This is like Checkmarx. So this is my blood pressure cuff. Checkmarx measuring my blood pressure. Well, let's just move you to the hospital, which can do it better, but you're still getting worse. So if you're adding more memory because you're getting more vulnerabilities, then maybe you're focused on the wrong problem. Maybe you're not really reducing your risk. You're just measuring it better. So, at the end of the day, this is about addressing the risk and deciding what I'm going to do about it. If you're not fixing it and not getting better at it, that might be the problem you might want to focus on.
I love it. All right. So thanks so much, Peter and Sean. And I'll just kind of wrap up as well. So if you had 2 takeaways today, I hope they're one, you're aware that there's technology out here to help you solve this worthwhile problem. And then 2, if you like what you saw, want to learn more about what, in particular, what Pete just said, how can you get to a point that you understand the level of risk you're actually reducing to your business, right? So follow up with us. Happy to show you more. Thanks, James, as well. With that, Mike, why don't I hand it back to you to wrap us up?
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks everybody for the time and commitment today. I've certainly found it a fascinating conversation. I think for me, as a relative layman, listening to some of these conversations, there's really 2 words that kind of strike me. One is trust, and that's trust in the process, the people, the technology, and actually building trust across that developer experience as well. So elevating the mundane tasks into something that's actionable. And also tool consolidation. So moving to something that's a proven platform and bringing together, two platforms that can really deliver those outcomes. So thank you to everybody for your time today, and I look forward to hosting you again.